Just a reminder again, we have our USEC test of time, which is not moving here, which is great. Okay, Test of Time Award. And again, just so that who were not present in the first session, this particular literature was published in USEC 2012. And again, this is the 15th year of USEC, which sounds amazing. So we were really happy. And again, as I mentioned, there was a committee involved there, and also the chairs took a cumulative decision to present this award to the work on a conundrum of permissions installing applications on an Android smartphone. Again, this is a very pioneer work in terms of when smartphone permissions and everything comes, and we have acknowledged that in our next presentations as well. With that said, I would like to invite Dr. Kelley, Patrick, and the stage. Again, we will be talking about it, and just a fun thing, Patrick will be using the same slides which he used, some of it, same slides which he used during USEC 2012, so it is like really, really great, and I think it brings in a lot of good memories about USEC as well. So let's welcome Patrick. And once you set it up, we will probably do the awards first.
Okay.
Yes. Let's give this a couple of minutes. In the meanwhile, I can give you the small momentum which we have created.
You. Okay. Hi, everybody. So since this is the Test of Time Award, that means that I'm old. And what you'll really see is in 2012, when we published this paper, I was a graduate student. And so I want to give you a little, so the first USEC was 2011, 2010, 2011. 2000, that's not 15 years.
No, but there have been like some breaks.
Oh, we took a break?
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't there. Okay, so a little background. As you heard earlier today, in fact, we have been studying Android permissions since the dawn of permissions. And as a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon, where I was doing my PhD, when I joined the PhD program, we did not have modern smartphones. The iPhone had not come out yet. Android was not a thing either. So we didn't have those. And I spent the first several years of my PhD thinking about privacy labels and privacy labels for websites. At the time, websites had privacy policies. Spoiler alert, they still do. And the first couple of projects I worked on were thinking about different ways to design privacy labels for websites. These are not all privacy labels for websites. You can't even see all of this. If you want to see it, go look at my dissertation, I guess. But there's a lot of standardized labeling efforts out there. We looked at a lot of them, including nutrition facts for food that happen in the US, as well as the privacy facts labels that were for banks and financial institutions, and how we could apply those to website privacy policies. But the problem with website privacy policies is partially that every website individually controls their own privacy policy, right? Their lawyers are working on those privacy policies. They post them. They can say whatever they want. And so even if you come up with a standard format, like the one here on the right, which in lab testing worked extremely well and, helps people understand the privacy of a website and the data collection they're doing, there's no way to actually enforce that across the whole internet. And getting the US government at the time to regulate such a design was not going to work, and nor was any of the rest of this. So, it seemed like this was kind of we can definitely do better privacy policies for websites, but how? And so then what actually happened that led to this specific paper was you get to hear stories in this because it's a test of time keynote and I get to talk about whatever I want, so you get stories. As a graduate student, I was like, I should go do an internship. And Sunny Consalvo, who is the third author on this paper, was at the time at Intel Labs Seattle. And back in the mid-2000s, Intel had a series of labs at universities. They had 4 of them where basically Intel created like these joint labs with universities. There was one at the University of Washington in Seattle, which is the one that I was at. But there were others, there were 4 of them again around the country. And I joined that lab to do my internship because I was like, I want to get some sort of industry experience before I figure out what I'm going to do next, which I actually thought was just be a professor. But I was like, I'll figure it out. I'll get some of that experience. And on the very first day that I joined in January of 2011, I was going to be there for the spring semester, January through May. They said, oh, we have a very important meeting now. All of the full-time research scientists have to go into this meeting. And at noon on my first day as an intern, they announced that the Intel labs were shutting down. And so all of the full-time employees at Intel Research were told they no longer had jobs. They would have jobs for the next 4 months as the labs were in their shutdown process. But basically, they all started updating their resumes and looking for new work. And I, the graduate student intern, was told, never mind about the project we thought you were going to do. That's all been canceled. Welcome to industry research. Go do whatever you want. And I said, all right, well, I'm sort of interested in these permissions on smartphones. Because if you take all of this stuff I've been thinking about with designing website privacy policies, you actually really only have 2, there were actually 3. Microsoft had smartphones at the time. But there were only 3 big companies doing smartphones that you could go out into the world and buy. Windows phones? Anybody? No? And I was like, this seems like a much easier thing, right? Because if you have all of these apps in the market, then they can just apply privacy labels. And then you only need to convince one of these companies to do this thing. And so I was like, let's do a study and start that. So from here on out, these are the original slides. You will note that the pictures of what Android looked like in 2012 no longer look like your modern smartphone. All of these images are dated. Everything in this presentation is dated. Enjoy that. And I'm not actually going to give you the original talk because I assume you were all here in 2012 listening to it and have read the paper many times since. And instead, I will just give some commentary on what it was that we did. So again, and also everything in here is out of date. Oh, and also I work at Google now, which runs Android. And so nothing I am saying for the rest of this talk that also slanders the Android and Google Play ecosystem has anything to do with my current employer. And so, don't think too much about that. So at the time, there were 250,000 applications, which is not very many, and no application review. Also not true anymore. We do, in fact, review the applications now. But at the time, we didn't, right? And so people were downloading these apps, and they were like, obviously, they're very safe and secure. Google must be checking every single one. No, that wasn't happening. And so we did this interview study where we wanted to understand from people. This was just the basic sort of like, are you worried about this app that you're about to put on your smartphone? Do you even know how to be worried about your smartphone and the other things that are on it? And do you trust this developer with your information? So is there a security risk? And really also, is there a privacy risk? And were people able to answer these questions? And at the time, again, a lot of things have changed. At the time, Apple gave you no permission information on the iPhone, and Android did give you permission information, but this was before you could accept or decline things, right? So everything that we were talking about in earlier talks where it was like, you can say yes to things or like have it be somewhat contextual or like give partial access or time-based access, none of that existed. You could see the list of permissions, and you could then decide if you wanted to download the app or not. That was it. And again, I promise all of these are real screens. These are not terrible color choices I made. I'm going to show you some mocks that I made later. They're going to kind of look like this. And I apologize. They wouldn't look like this now. But this is what smartphone technology looked like. And all of this is real. You definitely had to click multiple times to actually get to this permission screen. It was unclear if anyone really looked at it. It was really not a part of things. You could rotate your phone and see it in landscape mode, and I thought that was important at the time. But in general, these were just not good. right? It was like the permissions interfaces have all sorts of problems. It's hidden away. You can't opt out of individual things. There's no sense of importance. There was no sense of context. You couldn't explain what the permissions were for at the time. It just provided standard boilerplate language about what the permissions were. And so we did 20 interviews, partially in Seattle and partially in Pittsburgh, because again, I did go to Seattle, but then I also left early because I went back to Pittsburgh when the whole lab shut down. And so we did them in 2 locations, that's why. And we asked them this series of questions. And in general, some people really liked Android, but others didn't. They did all sorts of things that you would expect in terms of deciding when to install and buy apps. A lot of them, they just wanted free apps. When we asked them specifically about the permission screens, many said they just didn't understand what was going on, and they were like, I just look at the reviews and the rating. What is all this? They were not that concerned about malicious applications. Again, they believed Android was protecting them. And they felt like, again, like, you know, they had tried some privacy tools or other app checkers, but it was largely they were not that concerned. We did, including in this study, ask them about specific permissions. Okay, so some of those permissions were things like, there was a permission that said network communication, full internet access. It just allowed the app to talk to the rest of the internet. And these are what some of the participants described how they would tell someone what this permission was, right? And so again, you can see sort of a whole range of confusion, some amount of clarity, a little bit of like, why is it even a permission if this thing can go talk to the internet? But the permissions have changed over the years as well. We did this for many of the permissions. We sort of went through and sort of tried to work down the list. The permission lists have changed over time as well, so a lot of this is out of date. There were things, again, the permissions were really written for developers at the time, but they were being shown in a user-facing way. So there were things like act as an account authenticator, and again, people just really didn't know what that was. That freaks me out. What does that mean exactly? Because I'm not quite sure. Like exactly the types of standard things you would think you would get from people. And overall, we found they didn't really understand it. And so the conclusion of this study was that, in fact, users were not well prepared to make informed privacy and security decisions. While we were doing this process, Android changed things. And so if you remember the screen from earlier, this is still a 2012 presentation slide. If you remember the screen from earlier, things were like green and orange. At some point, they became teal. I don't know why. And they also changed how the permissions were displayed, and you could click on them to get more information. And so you could learn things like full internet access means it allows an application to create network sockets. And again, 13 years ago, I really liked pointing this out because I thought this was ridiculous language to use for end users. It turns out it still is. This is bad, right? Like this is clearly a time where Google did not know, the UX writers there were not yet on these screens, right? We do not say network sockets to users anymore, unless you have some very particular reason and it's not for something general like this. Oh, there's some information here that it's also fully out of date, so don't worry about it. And also like some stats that I closed with about how there's malware and maybe it's going down or up. Okay, and so then I closed this talk. That was it. That was the whole talk. That was what you saw if you were at USEC in 2012. USEC in 2012 used to be co-located at the time with financial crypto. So Jean and I and maybe others were on the island of Bonaire that year, which is one of the Dutch Antilles. Lovely tropical island at a resort called the Baja Flamingo Resort. I did have to look some of this up. We had a great time. You should really check it out. San Diego's nice too, but there's like a little bit of variation. So that was fine. That was like a pretty standard basic usability study, right? Why am I here? And there's a few reasons. One is there's a follow-up paper we did right after this. So the next year, we published this. By the way, I didn't mention this. The title of that paper, A Conundrum of Permissions, I thought I was being very clever, and I thought I was coming up with like the plural noun group word, you know, like how you have like a flock of flamingos, and like I was like a conundrum of permissions because they're just so confusing. It never caught on. So we published the next year this paper at Chi called Privacy as Part of the App Decision-Making Progress. I am not going to show all of the slides for that, though they mostly come in the same format. And I had, by that time, we'd gotten a little clearer on what people were doing with their apps. And we had actually started grouping apps into a few different categories of why people take apps at all. At the time, especially on Android, and again, all of this is Android-based still because iPhones didn't have permissions. Like they did in the back end, but there was no user-facing display of them. There were apps that came on the phone. There was a lot of Android bloatware at the time. Depending on which provider you were getting your Android phone through, there would just be tons of apps, and sometimes you couldn't take them off. There were apps that come from a trusted or already known brand, and there were apps that were picked from the market to fill a need. And the idea here was similar to websites. Like if you have an account with a bank, if you trust some sort of news organization, you're going to download that app regardless of what the permissions say. Right? Like if you're like, wow, my financial information is kept through Citibank, but I don't like the permissions, I'm not going to use the, like that didn't make sense, right? And so really the permissions only came into play with this third category, this like, as we would talk about, this app where you just, you need your kid in the back of the car to just stare at your phone for a little while, and so you're downloading some random thing. Or like you just want to play some game to kill time. Or like you just need a flashlight app because those weren't standard still at the time. And so there was this whole market of like thousands of flashlight apps that collected all sorts of data. Those were like the key moments where these permissions might actually change decision-making behavior. And so we tried to study that. The most relevant part of this Kai paper is we did a design intervention. We said, okay, what if we designed this privacy facts box, this little checklist, and we, based on what we had learned at the USEC paper, based on what we had done sort of by looking at these permissions, what if we like took all the permissions, turned them into fake categories? Again, these aren't real, right? Like there was no permission for health and medical information. And in fact, at the time, like photos was more complicated this, but we just cleaned up some things, right? And we were like, what if we made an easy to understand set of permissions that users could make decisions based on? And we used some of our how to best design privacy labels and said, this is the thing that should go into the app stores. And so we did a bit of a survey. We asked people how they pick apps. We did an interface test where we actually put those privacy facts labels into the things. And it turns out people were much better at choosing apps. I'm not going to show all the results from that, but then in my dissertation defense, as I was finishing my degree, I said, great, we're done, we've solved it. And I said, check, we've solved website privacy policies, and check, we've solved Android permissions. All you need to do is give people this checkbox. This is also an actual slide, not with the pink background, from my thesis defense. Two quick background stories now. One, here's a photo of me, 13 years ago, winning some award for the privacy research because, again, people really like those privacy policies. And the other story, yeah, sure, take pictures of that. The other story is in my thesis defense, okay? Sunny, who I interned with and the lab shut down, she had since moved on to, in fact, Google. And so when I was defending my defense and I was presenting all of this work, the question she asked publicly to the room, to my gathered defense, was, these privacy facts labels are great, but Google and Apple are never going to do it. Why should we care? Why does this research matter? And I was like, again, I was about to become a professor. I did not care about industry research. And I was like, I don't know, they should, right? Like they should do it. The research shows that they work better. I don't have a reason for why the lawyers are never going to do this. I don't care. And, I passed. And so it was fine. And I was like, well, oh well. No one's ever going to do this, but so what? I showed that it worked. So then time passed. I graduated from Carnegie Mellon. I went and became a professor because, of course, truly I was going to be an academic. I was a professor at the University of New Mexico for 4 years. And I left the University of New Mexico for what I thought was going to be a quick break. I was like, there were problems at American universities, unlike now. And so I was like, I just need a quick minute to just take a break from academia. And I was like, I'm going to go get that industry research experience that I never really got because, again, the lab shut down on my first day. And I was like, I will join Google and just hang out there for a year. As it turns out, I am still employed by Google. It is now 9 years later. And one of the things that happened over those 9 years was in June of 2020, Apple announced privacy labels. So I've tried, there's no timeline slide in this, but you'll have to sort of do the math visually. So again, we published the USEC paper in 2012 and the privacy decision-making paper in 2013. All of that research was actually done in 2011 and 2012. So 8 to 9 years later, Apple was like, what if we put privacy labels in the iPhone store? And I was like, cool idea. What a great idea. No one could have known. This is what Apple's privacy labels look like. And on the day they announced them in June 22nd of 2020, they actually made a little phone call to, not me, the Google employee, but to someone else who might have been a co-author on some of these papers and said, hey, we've read all your papers. We really like them. In like an hour, we're going to announce some privacy labels. Great. So research impact. And they read our papers. These two things look pretty alike. They did not give us any money or credit, but they did it, right? And that alone is good. As a reminder, this is 2020. So one, it's a pandemic, June 2020. I am working at Google. And Google pays, what do we decide this talk is or isn't being recorded? Great moment to ask that. Anyway, there's no one back there, so the answer must be maybe. I'm working at Google at the time, and Google has noticed that Apple has created these privacy labels. Google also noticed that it's kind of based on some research paper that it turns out a couple of Google employees wrote. On the USEC paper, there are 6 of us. 3 of us are currently and were also then employed at Google. None of us were employed at Google when we wrote the paper, but half of us are now. And so they reached out and they were like, hey, Apple just did this thing. We have been saying for years that we think privacy labels are a bad idea in the Play Store. That was like Google's stated, not mine, but Google's stated public policy position. That was what we said. Every time some regulator in Europe or the US came to Google and said, have you thought about exposing more privacy information in the App Store? They were like, no. Every app has a link to the developer's privacy policy. That is enough. And that was the stated position until, again, June of 2020. At this point, Google, the Android team specifically, which is not the team I work on, found me, and they were like, hey, we heard you did this thing. Apparently you work here. And could you tell us how to do it better than Apple? And I was like, I can, you're not going to like it. And that was true. So in May of 2021, Google also announced what Google calls safety labels. They're not privacy labels. And those launched a few months later. Those also, I think this is a video. Yeah. Those also look really similar. You can scroll down. You can see different things. You can click on things. You can get more definitions. They look kind of like the various Android things that they had before. And there is also a label when you're on the main page. So right above the reviews, you can see this sort of like short highlight view of data safety. Again, data safety labels, they're not privacy labels. Google is not copying Apple. Again, they look really similar to what we did a decade earlier. That was nice. So the moral of this story is do research that's good, and then a decade later, some company might implement it because they want to compete on privacy in the market. And it has nothing to do with where you work or what you're doing at the time. Great. So there has been a lot of research, a whole resurgence in research around privacy labels since then. This is just a short highlight of some papers that I like, some by co-authors in the past. As a person who, again, works at Google these days, I have not really been doing any research to investigate our own labels for all sorts of reasons. Who would trust me? But there is really good research on this. And as you can actually tell from some of the titles, there's a lot of skepticism around these labels. There's a lot of like, yes, sure, Apple has like made the permissions displays better to read than what Android had a decade ago, but the labels aren't necessarily doing a lot for users. And there are a bunch of reasons for this, some of which go back to the USEC and Kai papers, which are like, they're still not doing the most easy things, which is like, you have a review score, which is 4.7 out of 5 or whatever, but there's no privacy score, right? There's no privacy comparison. You have written out a bunch of words, but you have not made it actually easy to compare when you're looking at apps. You're not taking those privacy scores and comparing them into market decisions, right? So you're not like auto helping or increasing in the rankings privacy better apps, privacy preserving apps, apps that do less tracking. There are some differences in how Google and Apple have implemented things, and even papers that are like, what happens when they don't work? One of the very first papers that came out was actually a Mozilla, I don't even know if it was a paper or just like a blog post, where Mozilla looked at a bunch of apps and compared them to the privacy policies and were like, guess what? They don't match. And again, from my point of view, this is fine, right? Like the whole point of these labels is for people who are really interested to dive deeper and to understand what these apps are doing and to have more transparency and to, at some point, help consumers in the market make choice. It is sometimes hard to get there. Okay, so that concludes the part of this talk where I talk about privacy labels. I want to talk about two very briefly, more recent projects because I have done research in the last decade, I promise. And I also want to talk a little bit about how some of those things inform what we have done since then. So a big project that I worked on for quite a while, and we have a Kai paper coming out that will be, it's a Tokai paper, the journal, but it'll be presented at Kai in Tokyo in 2 months, around the 9+ years of work we've done around at-risk users at Google. And one of the things that was always true, looking at the labeling projects that we shared earlier, is that not everyone reads food packaging labels when they are in the grocery store. And there's been extensive research done on this. And so when sometimes people are like, oh, well, these things are useless, like we put these labels on things and people still drink sugary drinks and eat foods that are bad for them. But the labels, we know, do not help everyone evenly. They help people with food allergies. They help people who are on specific diets or have certain health conditions. They help mothers who are feeding families and their children. And this has been true about food labels. It's true about the banking labels. It's almost certainly true about privacy labels, though I haven't seen any good work on that yet in the app stores. But it's one of the things we know from just how we are trying to keep people safe at Google across our products. And so we have a bunch of work on at-risk users. I'm going to point to one paper that sort of highlights some of that. It's an SOK paper, a systemization of knowledge paper, where we looked at 95 different papers that were all about different user groups that are potentially more marginalized or more vulnerable. And again, in the current moment and climate, it continues to be important to understand groups that are going to be at higher risk. They may be more vulnerable to attacks. They may have more attacks levied at them. There have been many different groups that security and privacy researchers have studied and helped to understand to improve their security and privacy postures. We have done a lot of this work at Google ourselves. Personally, have been involved with work around politicians, around YouTube creators, around people who are experiencing financial insecurity, and others. And so understanding how these groups, the concern, and again, one of the deep reasons for doing this work is because we could endlessly try to understand how different groups think about privacy and security. There must be things that are shared so that we can start to build frameworks so that we can start to protect them at scale. One of the things that I have learned the most about being at Google is how to think about scaling some of these solutions. And so this at-risk framework really helps give us some ways, and I'm not going to go into full depth on this, but how we start to think about factors that groups might share. And so even just the first one here, any group that is being targeted legally or through political means, has some shared reasons why they are going to be at greater risk. And one of those is that they have an adversary who has a lot of resources, right? And these things intersect in different ways. We don't really have a full theory yet of how to think about this across the board, but we know that working with these groups and helping to understand them really makes all of our users safer. And so we're doing this work and continuing to, again, in complicated times. And then finally, because it is 2025 and I cannot not mention AI, I tried for many years to avoid AI research at Google. That was a losing battle. And one of the things that I have done a bunch of work on is explainability and public opinion surveys, whether they are in privacy or in AI. And so we've done some large public work on how different countries are thinking about AI, when countries are more positive or more concerned. In general here, you can see from this, the West is more concerned. The more developing countries might be seen as more excited, and South Korea is an outlier and believes that AI is just useful, helpful robots. There's a whole paper on this that you can read. I've also done a bunch of work on explainability and how we can start to explain AI to people. And we have a public resource on this at explainability.withgoogle.com, which I think the next slide says, where we're thinking about how we can actually inform people about AI. There's a bunch of work on AI privacy, including by people here, and including some past papers that I have worked on. I think people have a really tough time with privacy and security already, and so adding AI to this picture does not make anyone's decision-making processes easier. And so trying to work through how we help people understand what AI is, and again, how we do that in alignment with the regulation that's coming out around AI. If I have one comment to the last presenter, as we think about the sort of ISO standards or the NIST standards, they're being written in a time where things are changing so quickly that even complying with that may not actually be the right experience for a policy. It may actually be at odds with what would be better for users. One of the very first drafts of submissions to the AI Act that was written in Europe included some expert working feedback that AI should give explanations every time an AI system makes a decision. And for any of you who actually have programmed AI or understand it, some AI systems are making decisions continuously, right? Like if you're in a self-driving car, it is constantly reevaluating the conditions on the road and if it should stop and not hit something. But even for things like, and again, this was done before the generative chat systems, but like, I don't know exactly what you consider a decision in that it's really probably each next token that it is returning. And you really, as a user, do not want an explanation every time that system gives you a new token, right? Like you might at some point later want to go back and say, why did you say that terrible thing or that incorrect thing to me? But you don't necessarily need that in the moment. And I think it's really important to focus on when explanations are useful. So we published a rubric with 21 items at explainability.withgoogle.com that also has example screenshots from this boating app that we made, which is why there was a boat image 2 slides ago. I'm pulling things from various stuff. And we also have a lesson for middle school students that we've made that has over 2 million views where middle school students can learn about AI. Because again, like we're really just trying to explore this, like how do we teach people about these things? And some of these concepts of what AI will be doing in terms of privacy and security decision-making overlap. These are 3 papers that are about AI and sort of maybe that AI privacy overlap that I've done, so that if you don't want to ask me questions about privacy labels from a decade ago, you can ask more relevant recent questions. So with that, I think I mostly want to wrap up the talk part and leave it open to questions if you all have them.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions already.
Hi, thanks for the great talk, and I'm Riyad, working at CISPA from Germany. So my question on the privacy level. So privacy level basically showed at the early stage of the user journey, but do you think it actually affect on the user privacy granting decisions? For example, I installed Uber before coming to the USA. And at that time, in that scenario, probably when I'm installing, I read the privacy level, and after some days gone, now I'm at USA, probably I missed out or I forgot that privacy level. Then why does it actually matter? Or do you think that privacy level should be placed close to the decisions? Thank you.
Did you really read the privacy label? Like, no.
Yes, but 3 or 4 months ago, if you ask the question, I never read the privacy level, never.
Yeah, so I think, again, I think I am not like we must put the labels everywhere. They are solving all the problems. I think that the labels are, in fact, quite limited in scope, right? So if you were coming to the US and you were like, I need to use a car sharing service, you don't have very many options. And I guess you could have read the privacy labels for Uber and Lyft and then picked one. The dated answer is that, okay, so the Federal Trade Commission in the United States back in the mid-90s were like, hey, there's an internet now. And we think this internet might be doing bad things with consumers' data, so all these websites should put privacy policies on them. And if the companies don't put privacy policies on their websites, we're going to regulate rules about those privacy policies. The companies then all did it, right? They just put up privacy policies. And the FTC was like, great, mission accomplished. All of these websites now have long privacy policies, and so consumers can be informed and make good choices. We know this model doesn't work, right? Like we know that people are not deciding which websites to use just based on those privacy policies. And so for many individuals making decisions like yourself, if it really is about which app to install or not, it's probably not useful, especially when you have limited choice to begin with. In the car sharing service example, in the I want to check the news on this reputable news website, right? Or I have this banking app. I think in the cases it's going to be easiest or most useful is when you really do have like 20 options and you don't care about any of them, right? You're just like, I don't care. I can use any of these. I can play any of these stupid games to occupy myself. Just give me the one that collects the least data. And again, in many ways, you shouldn't have to read the label. They should be auto-sorted based on privacy, or you should be able to specify your privacy settings before you get in. It also doesn't take care of, I think, the broader question you're asking, which is like, again, these days, you have a little bit more control over what you share with apps and how. And so helping people through those questions of like, should I share all of my photos with this app or just some of them? Should I share my location with this app just in the moment or all the time? Those are more nuanced questions that privacy labels just are not made for. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions. So, first is an easy question. So given that you just got the Test of Time award at USEC, and then you're the chair of SOUPS, which of these events is the better? Which of these is your favorite? And then I have a harder question. So you were in academia and then you've been in the industry for a while, and there are a lot of kind of early career PhD students here. So based on things that you've learned in industry research, what advice would you have for academic researchers on how to maybe be more impactful with the work that they're doing?
Yeah. Okay, good. So for the first question, I think of USEC and SOUPS as like siblings. And I'm not actually the parent of either of them, but with relatives, you do not pick favorites. And so they are siblings. You should hang out with both SOUPS and USEC because they are members of the same family and have a lot of overlap. So I'm going to avoid that question.
Just wanted to add.
Thank you. Yeah. This broader question of how do we think about? I tell people often I expect I will, in fact, be back at a university doing research again. I know I said I would take a year break, and it is 9 years later. I guess I'm bad at time. But I do expect to be in academia again. I'm still publishing a lot. I'm still running SOUPS. I'm still doing things with academic research. And I think what I certainly say is that being actually in industry has changed a lot of the ways I would do research, partially because of, industry is often looking for solutions. And I think one of the reasons why the privacy labels continue to live on in the ways that they do is because it wasn't just, not to knock any specific study here or many of the studies I have also published, but like a lot of times we're like, wow, these problems are really hard. And what we need is more education or people to understand things or like things that the platforms could change that are very hard to test in a lab setting. And design intervention-based solutions are, as it turns out, actually really easy for people to adopt with no involvement from myself at all, right? Like they were just like, we're running with this. And I was like, great. And so I think to the extent that we can start to propose solutions, that is always great. I will say industry also spends a lot of time making fun of the solutions that academics put into their papers, because what happens is we do not often understand the constraints that are actually happening in these systems. And sometimes industry has tried things in tests and those things don't work. And so it is still very complicated. But I think the more we can think about solutions, interventions, there's also a whole bunch of research that generally people in industry either don't do or don't publish. So anything where you're comparing different platforms, Google's just not going to publish papers where we're comparing ourselves to somebody else, because even if we could do it fairly, no one would trust us. And so thinking about like the ways we strategize research, I think can be really helpful. I also think the more, we have done a lot of work with student researchers, collaborations with universities. I think there are lots of opportunities for that and continue to be. And so I think work with people in industry is another solution I would have. I mean, again, you heard my story. I kind of tried and kind of failed. But Sunny and I are both still at Google. We're not actually on the same team right now, but we have worked together throughout the years. And so we have now been working together since this paper. And so that alone is a great long-term research impact story.
Much. And again, just to add to that, as an early career academic, I would say that collaborations are always welcome from both the industry people. So yeah, we have one more question.
So you said it took about 10 years for your research to start appearing in people's life. And it's a difficult thing that you said to the academics in the audience, that you made a difference and you knew you made a difference. And you're getting credit, right? But you're getting credit here, and there's 1 billion people that are interacting with your apps, right? So the scale of, you've got a lot of citations, that's great. There's 1 billion people that are interacting with those apps because you ask a question early. And that's one of the things that the Test of Time Award always reflects. Like, you pick an important question that makes more and more of a difference later. So do you have any advice for emerging faculty on how to, identify projects that will make a difference later?
Yeah, so 2 things about that. This was not the first paper on permissions. I think at least Adrian Porterfelt and Serge Egelman and their collaborators have an earlier paper on Android permissions and how much people totally did not understand them. That came out around the same time, but probably about a year earlier. And so this was not the first paper on permissions, and theirs probably has more citations. But I think one of the things that made this land well is that I only covered it in like 1 slide, but I had been working on privacy labels for 3 years at that point, right? And so I had not just like switched to permissions because they were new and cool. I was like, oh, I have this toolbox of things and I can apply it in this very new and emerging domain. And I think because I had spent over a year reading all sorts of the labeling on energy labeling, on the different pharmaceutical labeling, on the labeling on cigarettes and other cancer labeling that was happening. Like, I was really trying to understand how we were thinking about consumer protection through labeling. And I think it was that background that allowed me to say, oh, here's this new issue, let me apply this new thing. There are plenty of really good researchers who are like constantly doing work on the new hot topic just because it's the new hot topic. That has never been my approach. You also heard me say I tried to avoid AI for like forever. But it was really about like that toolkit matching the current problem. And I think bringing those 2 things together was part of what really helped. So yeah.
And one thing I just want to add, like, I know the citations and everything, by the way, this has more than 500 citations, as we mentioned in the first session as well. But yeah, that is definitely important, but also the impact which it creates. So for example, like Jean's work on privacy labels, plus yours, plus CMU's for sure, and Web have mentioned some of them, which was published in policy focused. I always add it to my classes. I'm not saying I am making an impact, but at least like people like me who are adding these works into the classes, and then 50 somewhat people or 100 somewhat people who are knowing more from it. So that's also an impact which probably does not have a direct measurements yet, but it still does. So just so you know, like, we are trying to bring in industry, academia, and public policy and everything, but it does have an impact. So to all the students who are working, even though it takes a decade, still it actually has an impact, right? So yeah, that said, any other questions? We have a couple of more minutes, and this can be your opportunity. Okay, that said, how about I ask about the explainable AI work which you are doing. So there was a paper published, I guess, last year at USEC by Shouvik Das's lab on XAI, which looked into like developers' perspective a little bit more. So given your works and also what you mentioned very correctly, now that AI is taking very real-time decisions, at that time, do you think it can be an explainable overload, like how security overload is a thing as well?
Most of my work focuses on what explanations I think consumers need. And so I think most of the time when you're using an AI, this is like, okay, so all of you know at this point that privacy especially, mostly security too, are secondary tasks, right? They're the thing that pops up and annoys you when you were trying to do something else, right? You were trying to just answer your phishing email and security got in the way. How annoying, right? But like, you were trying to do something else. I think that we need to keep in mind that most AI explanations are going to be that too. People are not like, wow, I really want to learn all about how this AI works. when I am just trying to have it rewrite my email or do my homework or fix this math problem or plan my vacation or whatever else I want this AI to do. And so the explanations need to be used, again, judiciously when there's some sort of moment where something has gone wrong, when it's the first time that you're in the app, when you're using it in a new context, when there's been some sort of error where you want to give feedback and say, this went wrong. And I am most focused on those explanations. There's a lot of other good work on interpretability and like mathematical provability of explanations and other things for developers, almost all of which I'm like, great, we have lots of problems to solve with AI. But I am most interested in like actually, again, having people go about their day, book their rideshare, like get the thing done that they wanted to, and make sure that they are as comfortable as they can be in that process with whatever is happening with their data or this system, or again, this company that has access to a bunch of things about themselves. In the Soups paper, about AI and privacy, we asked people a bunch of privacy-related AI questions, and even though people clearly don't understand much about AI, especially not large language models right now, they understand how this will impact their privacy. They know that these AI systems are going to feel really invasive. They're going to have highly personal information. They're going to lead to more collection of data, and that also they're not going to have consent in the ways they want to say, I want to turn this off. And so, like, those issues really mostly apply to other sorts of systems too. They're just going to, again, be magnified by this use of putting AI everywhere. And so we can still sort of take all of the things we have learned as a community over the last 20 years and start to apply them in the same ways in AI systems. And it does not require it does not require a deep technical understanding of large language models to be like, hey, let people turn it off, right? Like that is not a requirement of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. With that said, let's give a round of applause.